Morning.
Hey Eric, how's it going?
Good. Can you hear me okay?
I can. Well, it's nice to meet you.
You as well. You as well. And I feel like, in a way, I've have a little insight on you, having read about, I don't know, 60, 70 pages of your book so far.
Oh, okay. Well,
Toxic.
I
Yeah.
appreciate you reading it. What are your thoughts so far on it?
Yeah. So, I mean, y- y- I guess you probably read parts of mine, so
I
you
read
know.
it. Yeah, I read actually read it. Yeah, I read it completely. Yeah.
There are a lot of similarities between our books. I think yours is, I think, more thoroughly researched and high-minded. You obviously include a great deal more, or to the extent that they're similar. I mean, a lot more specific references in the Bible, and yeah, I found that very interesting. I, it helps, right? There's something intentional about the way I wrote my book, and we can talk about that if you like.
Yeah,
But
I'd love to.
I do acknowledge that I did leave out some specificity and specific references back, and so it was. I enjoyed reading your book, is what I'm saying.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
So far,
You know,
toxic dog, toxic. Is it dogma? I'm forgetting the name of the section. Uh,
uh, oh, there's
the first 100 pages or so.
yeah, it covers toxic, yeah, dogma and doctrine.
That's it.
Yeah. And then getting into the the God, the Great and Terrible, specific books of the Bible, and certain themes that are really quite, I think, troubling, that the church and believers tend to look right past because they're taught to, and the church doesn't talk about these things. So, but
That's a whole other topic. That could easily justify another book about how the church seems to ignore this for all kinds of reasons. But I have this feeling that most Christians really don't embrace some of those things, a great deal of those things. And if they
yeah.
only really not just knew them, but like understood them and
Hmm.
acknowledged how integral they are to the faith, it would be a whole different ballgame.
I agree 100%. Um, I want to talk about all this. I'm recording it now, so I mean, this is all will be preamble. But well, let me do my introduction, and we'll just get going because this is going to be a great talk.
Great.
All right. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Between the Lines. And today we have a special guest, Eric Guthrie, otherwise known as Pastor Lucky. Eric, welcome to Between the Lines.
Thanks, Mark. It's nice to meet you.
You as well. Now, Eric, you have a book. It's called Enemy Playbook: Powerful New Strategies Demonstrated by Skeptics to Raise Doubts in Christians. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And because you connected with me through another interview I did with Deborah Grace and her book Crucifying the Bible, and so I was really pleased that you reached out to me and that you shared your book, and even more grateful that you bought a copy of Toxic, and so I do appreciate that. And it's kind of nice to meet other people who see things in the larger picture, it took me a long time to find my tribe of people who were disenfranchised with the church and with their faith, you know. But that's one thing. I really don't know much about your faith, so I got some questions. I mean, a lot of questions dealing with like writing and those kinds of things, because this is a writing show. But beyond that, because of what you write about, I mean, there's still so many other things to talk about. So, um, but but let me ask you that, like, what was your religious upbringing?
Well, actually, before I get started, I too wanted to kind of thank Deborah Grace for putting us in contact. She's really been a friend to me, but at the very least, she's been very helpful, provided guidance, and was generous with her time. And she's obviously very knowledgeable about what she's writing about. So I just can't thank her enough for putting me in touch with you and all the assistance she provided me as a burgeoning author. Um, so to answer your question, Were you asking about me as an author?
Yeah, well, we're going to talk about a lot of writing things, usually because most of my shows, interviews tend to focus on fiction writers. A lot of my questions skew towards fiction. But Deborah was the first nonfiction writer, and also we dealt with spirituality. And it was at a time where when we met that I was really, she was the first person I had met who finally found a very similar vein that I did to kind of tap into and to express why she's a non-believer. And so it was like, oh, I'm not the only one. And then since then I've met a fellow other groups. I'm in a couple atheist writers groups, although I'm not an atheist. I'm not sure. Well, if when you continue reading Toxic, you will know my views on God. Um, I'm only the slenderest of Martians. Am I holding on to the fact that there might be a God? Um, if there's a God, I can accept that there's a deist God, just a creator God who's out there, just just jerking off in space and creating things. But as far as the loving God that I was taught to believe in, no, I don't think that God exists. But
Yeah, I love this topic. I'm going to jump to it, but I want to make
yeah,
sure that I answer your first question first. You asked me
sure.
about me. So I'm a business analyst and a technical writer for my day job. I've been doing that for, gosh, I guess close to 20 years now. Uh, and oh, I remember your question now. You're asking about what my real upbringing was.
Yeah, but no, that's all good. I do technical writing as well, so that's great. We got something more to talk about as writers.
But yeah, my upbringing was I was brought up by, I guess, what you'd call agnostics. My parents did a good job of trying to introduce me to religion. They certainly did not keep me from it. Uh, I was put in parochial schools for like 80% of my education before college. Um, uh, and my parents tried to explain to me why having an open mind is important. So I got all the exposure I needed, but they were not believers. I mean, it's hard to make yourself into one if you aren't one, right?
Right.
Um, but
Because you kind of tend to
Episcopal,
grow up in that. I mean, that's you are like I always grew up in the church. It was just this was the lenses that I was given. Like, here's the worldview, here's reality, you know, and that's just you have that assumption that this is reality that we see so much in Christianity. They just assume they're right and everyone's wrong because it's part of the doctrine, and exactly the lenses I grew up with in a very fundamentalist, Pentecostal background, and that has a whole other can of worms to it.
for sure. Yeah, you raised a point a second ago about big picture. How about how you like to talk with somebody else who's seeing it from I guess a 10,000-foot view, if that's what you meant. And that's an important issue to me. I'm the son of an academic, so I really appreciate attention to just detail, but I really like knowing that I'm listening to people who know exactly what they're talking about. And so I really respect that kind of formal pedagogy, that formal type of accruing knowledge and peer review. All that stuff really resonates me. Let me just make that very clear. But I really it occurred to me somewhere along the way that approach this is just my opinion, right? This is what suits me, but that level of detail and specificity and analytical nuance is inappropriate for looking at Christianity. And that may sound strange, but I just don't feel like Christianity ever provided any kind of basic evidence that ever would rose to the level where you would be using that kind of detail to analyze it. It's almost I keep using this analogy. I'm not sure if it's good or not, but if you and I drove along and saw a car smashed along the side of the road, right next to a guardrail that had a mark on it, and we just looked at it and said to each other, yep, there's a car that was in an accident and it looks like it hit the guardrail. And somebody was standing there and said, no, the car wasn't in an accident. It imploded on itself. And it just looks a lot like it was in an accident. And so we know that the next kinds of questions that would go into the research or investigation about this, right? It would not be calling, somebody from NASA who understands colors and spectroscopy to start looking at the paint to decide whether or not it actually touched other things and at what force level, those kinds of things. So it just, in a way, that kind of specificity seems like it just has no business in this discussion about the veracity of Christianity. So that's one reason why I wrote my book at the level that I did, was because that's the level I think this conversation should be at. We really don't need to leave the shallow end of the pool to test it and to talk about it.
Yeah, that's where our books differ. Like you had said, I mean, I spent most of my professional life in academia, and I still am. So uh, it's hard. I think, as I even mentioned in the book, you can take the believer out of the academic, but you can't take the academic out of the apostate. Once I had dealt with the emotional toll of becoming an apostate and realizing that everything I believed was just a bunch of shit, um, and for 40 years of cognitive dissonance finally coming to a head, you know, my intention was never to write that book. It was just I just started venting my emotions and all the things that bothered me about Christianity and my belief and how angry I was and frustrated. And 2 days later, when I had written 40 pages, I'm like, oh, this needs to turn into something. I might as well. And that's when once the emotions were dealt with, then it was better, easier for me to process academically, do my research and diligence. And for me, it wasn't as much like what your approach. I agree with you in some ways, because I think most Christians are rather ignorant of what their Bible says. They know the doctrine that's been taught to them, but they don't know their Bible. um and something I'd always known, but one allowing me to research and to be able to point out these very specific things, it was like taking the game to their yard, with their rules. Like, okay, fine, I'm going to force you to force Christians to confront what's in their Bible, since most of them lack knowledge. And that was my approach. But that's just one of, your approach is very different. We both see the same problem from different angles. I think they're both important. So, kind of, is it because your position is it's really impossible to deal with irrational belief with rational thinking? I mean, is that why you really kind of don't need to be, have overkill in this area?
Well, so sure, I get that question, but before I answer it, I'll tell you what's interesting. Firstly, and that was what you said about your writing approach, which was quite different from mine. It seems like you had a cathartic phase
Mhm.
initially to kind of vent and get these things out, maybe just see what they look like on paper or see how you feel after you've expressed them narratively. And then the analytical side of you came out, and that's interesting. For me, it was if it's the opposite, but it was quite different, where I had ideas building up. I had these kind of thoughts, and what I sounded to me, uh, maybe some chunks of wisdom in there, mixed in there somewhere. So, and I found myself having several hundred pages of rather poorly organized, just kind of independent thoughts. And I thought, okay, I've got a book's worth, right? And only through that process did I end up throwing out like the vast majority of that. And that was really just the seed. That was the starting point. Going through the culling of all that kind of writing prep stuff is what started something that then later on was actually a process to me. So it's quite different.
Mhm.
But why don't you ask me that question again about the rationality of thought? I didn't quite catch it.
I was approaching it because you said we don't need to go beyond the shallow end of the pool, and I was just trying to articulate that in a way that my version of or view of that is like it's impossible to deal with irrational belief with rational thinking. That's the thing. It's hard to provide facts and information because Christians are taught to push everything through the God sieve. and facts aren't important. It's your faith. Especially when your religion tells you to lean not to your own understanding. And we see through a glass darkly, even though God gave all these books to them to understand himself, understand God. He just says, just don't expect to understand and don't think too much. Just trust. And to me, that's dangerous thinking. And that's what prevents a lot of Christians from accepting truths about their Bible, because they're not taught, they're ignorant, and that's in the truest sense of the word. They lack understanding because the church isn't going to tell them about the Gospel of Matthew. No one knows who wrote that, so we slap that name on. They're not going to say, "Yeah, the end of this book of Mark, the last 12 verses of here, those were added on 200 years later." They're not going to say those kinds of things. Or, yeah, the flood myth, that was 1,200 years old by the time whoever put it in Genesis did. They're not going to say those things, because then it undermines the doctrine that this is God's word and it's seamless and perfect and all this jazz. So you can't. Those facts don't tend to mean much to Christians, because they just said, well, God, it's hard to break that wall.
Yeah, I that certainly resonates with me, what you're saying. I'll tell you, I may have an even less orthodox view than many agnostics, and atheists, if that's what you want to call me. And that is that, yes, it's true that you really have to suspend a lot of rationality to believe in Christianity. But I mean, let's face it, if that God were real and if he were true, he could be exhibiting divinity, he could be performing miracles, he could be resolving contradictions, even some paradoxes, I suppose. So, right, like, I just don't see any, there's not a whole lot of sway you're going to put to the Christian, because when you try to explain things in terms of evidence and rationality, they're going to be thinking along the lines of what I just explained. Look, this is God we're talking about, right? He
Right.
can do whatever he wants, right?
Exactly.
It's in the Bible, don't you know?
Exactly. They use the Bible to prove the Bible's validity. Right.
So well, I guess what I've evolved to think, I didn't fully exhibit what I'm telling you now until this book was completed. This book helped me grow in my way of thinking, because I used a lot of some evidence-based arguments in my book even. But now I think the questions need to be even more reductionist, right? These questions need to be asked at the very fundamental level and go no further than that, really. What I mean to say is, specifically, there are matters such as God putting people in this world with traits that he gave to them. He created a place of horror that is a place that he sends people if they don't return his love for him. This, you can't call that love. That's an important thing. And
No, but they will say it's because God is so holy and righteous. That's the argument. And it's because all the world is the way it is because of the original sin. We're all to blame, and we're all sinners, and we don't deserve God's love. I mean, that's the line that you're fed, and it's
right,
reinforced with all those horrible, songs,
it is. I mean, I get it. And see, there again, I get it. And that could very well be the way it is. God could be kind of a hard ass, right?
Sure.
And there's something that you're not going to be satisfied with in terms of a normal relationship. He's cruel, perhaps, right? That could be the case. I acknowledge
Yeah,
that.
if the Bible had said, boy, God's a dick and he's just cruel and he's just a bastard and he's just a motherfucker, that's that's then okay. I see more of that.
But
He's going to
that's
ignore the
not the
police. Right.
case.
Right.
See, God
Exactly.
asserts God asserts love. And when you assert love, you you cannot conflate love as humans understand it, as recipients of love. You cannot have a cogent definition for what love is that is conflated with that kind of cruel behavior. that may be something, right? I acknowledge it. There may be something else that gods can have for their subjects, or for people, or for perhaps other gods, or what have you. But that's not love, because love only means something as it relates to how humans feel like they're being treated. If I love you, Mark, and right, what it means in the sense that God has used it in order to make people feel at ease with being a part of the faith and accepting revelation, is I care about you. I get you. I empathize with you. The problems you're going through, I get. Um, your well-being matters to me, right? That's what love means, or is what God wants people to think he means when he says love. And that is a wonderful, healthy, holistic definition of love. And anything beyond that, anything that includes acts of cruelty, where there's retribution given, where loyalty is not returned, this is clearly not love. It may be something else, but that's not love. And if you think it's love, then love loses its definition. And I'm not really giving it justice. I think I want to expand more on that in the months ahead, but that's a very important theme I'd like to expand on.
Sounds good. So by expanding, you mean you're working on another book, or are you going to work on another edition of this book?
I have another project I'm working on. I definitely would like to write another book. I'm trying to think about what's going to be the case that makes the most sense to make to an
Hmm.
audience that would have access to.
Hmm.
But I'm also working on a study about prayer. Um, I'd like to provide a better approach to showing the efficacy um, of prayer on supernatural acts in ways that some of the studies that you probably know about the effectiveness of prayer have shown shortcomings. I think there's some real fertile ground there. And I, I even think, even though it's sort of counterintuitive, I might be able to get Christians on board to this kind of effort that I'm talking about. And there were Christians and even nuns and monks, I believe, as that participated in some of those prayer analysis studies that, like I said, that you probably know about. So I'd like to do that, but I'd also like to write another book as well once I can formulate a good thesis.
So we're staying in the nonfiction genre for you, or are you thinking maybe one day you might enjoy writing fiction?
Oh gosh, my wife is a really a good writer, right? She can really formulate good stories and think in a really nonlinear fashion. So I think I'm going to leave any of the possibility of a fiction story in this family of mine to my wife, if that ever happened. But so no, I mean, this is more my writing. It is really just a function of my doing a lot of writing. I don't know if I got good at it, but I learned how to be efficient with my time and organize my thoughts okay, and come up with some ways to make a good argument. And I did become passionate about this topic, right? There's something.
It's an oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, I interrupted
Yeah,
you.
I
Go
was
ahead.
just going to say it just became weirdly fascinating how inaccessible Christians seem to be to persuasion, and it just got me further and further and further and further down the rabbit hole of, well, what would it take to
Right.
change a mind, right?
Yes,
Sorry, you were going to
precisely.
say something.
No, I was just gonna. You were kind of intimating where I wanted to go. Was just like how did you get to this book? You know, being an agnostic and not having a big catharsis or years of cognitive dissonance tearing you apart, and not studying, having studied the Bible and doctrine thoroughly, perhaps as an agnostic or an atheist or whatever. Why would you? You know, but. So that was my next question, because you also interviewed Christians for your book to kind of see their beliefs. And that's what I'm fascinated about this process. Like how did you approach these believers, and or did it just come from your experiences with them, talking with them, or were they very open about why they refuse to listen to evidence, and why they could make arguments? Because it becomes all circular, eventually it all points to, well, God is God and he's always good. We're not meant to understand. We're not supposed to trust our own understanding, just have faith. I mean, these are things that, it doesn't matter what evidence you throw against faith. That's it just doesn't matter how much, because they refuse. A lot of Christians won't, like you said, will not. It's not that, well, they won't bend, but they also don't even want to acknowledge anything that could be challenging to their faith. My family has pretty much like just done this to me, because they just don't want to deal with it. They just refuse to acknowledge it, to try to understand it. Some still try to like invite me to church and just think that that's all I need. I just need to come back to Jesus. And I'm like, you have no clue what I know. I know your Bible better than you. I'm asking you to simply confront these verses and tell me what it means to your faith. But they refuse.
Yeah, and like you said, that's a theme. That's a point I make in the first third of the book. So I want to make sure I answer your question. But the book is organized into basically three sections. The first one is where I sort of make a case of what I think the mindset and issues are with the Christian way of thinking. Then I go on to give some strategies to help a skeptic have more fruitful discussions with the Christian. And then I introduce what I call scenes, which are basically vignettes or scenarios that introduce a story, a picture, and some pretty penetrating leading questions that should form the basis of a lively debate. But to answer your question, the process was, I wanted to do a field study, right? I'm not a researcher. I did not create a formal study, but I did want this to be ground in something more than just, Eric's ideas, right? So that my hope was that it would provide a little bit more grounding in my assertions and testing of them, and it did. I'm so glad that I did that. But I found them on social media and just on the web. I offered them a little compensation for their time, and I spent 2, 3, I think 2 or 3, sometimes 4 hours with some of them. And there were 10 Christians that I interviewed, and there was a range of, I could call it committedness, but there's no exact word. Maybe it's devoutness, but some of them were very serious about their faith, and others seemed to be able to have a slightly more objectivity about it. But they were all very friendly, very nice, and it was very interesting. I decided not to try out the book on them. In other words, I did not take my arguments and say, well, let me show the world that they work, and so I'm going to debate some Christians and watch this.
Sure.
I decided not to do that. I instead wanted to, like I said, kind of hone some of my arguments better based on the responses I heard back from them. So I would sort of gently introduce some of these ideas. I would explain to them why I felt that way, and then we would have a very gentle kind of back and forth about it.
That sounds like a great way to approach, because you're coming to them as someone who's questioning and uncertain, so you don't cause any threat. That's how I perceive it, and I know I'm very threatening, because of again, it's nothing that I go out of my way to do, to say I'm going to bring your faith down, as much as that, because I know the scriptures fairly well. I can make a good argument. I can point out things that they don't know about. I know about Bible history and how things were done, and a little bit about that kind of study. And so it automatically puts them on the defensive. And especially since I used to be a believer, they just tend to think that Satan's got me, or that I'm just full of sin. That's the like I made a shipwreck of my faith because I've done something, and that Satan's talking through me, or some ridiculous stuff, you know. And so I like your approach. I can see why they might want to open up to you, because then that gives them opportunity to kind of share their faith and proselytize a little bit too.
Yeah, they did. And my book is replete with reminders and justifications for why I think respect and empathy are just, it's part of the strategy, right? That's basically what my book was. If you want to get anywhere, you need to think of this more, this intransigence that Christians exhibit about their faith, more as a problem of tight knots in a string that's going to take a lot of time and effort to untangle. And that you're only going to be able to do that if you're being very cognizant of where they come from, that they probably have good reasons for believing these things. And you're also going to have to be doing uh, almost artificially exhibiting your own flexible perspective, right? You're going to be showcasing for them so that they can model, hopefully, in time over how you formulate your thoughts, how you can see things objectively. And that's only going to happen if they know that you're earnest, that you care about them. And there's another thing I recommend. I probably should have made more of this. It's just one of the strategies that I added, but I recommend to my readers, or to debaters of Christians, to abandon the position of there being no God when they have debates. And what I mean by that is, or the reason I say that is because it's the least defensible thing, I think, that an agnostic can have, or a non-believer of Christianity can have. Neither you nor me nor anyone can prove whether there is or isn't a God, to maybe to your original point, Mark. And so to have any kind of, to use there not being a God as some kind of implicit foundation of where you're coming from in that argument, just automatically is going to turn off a Christian. And it should. You don't have certainty about that. I know you don't, because you don't know anything that I don't know about that. So I think it's important. I personally think it's important to sort of be okay with people having a kind of a general, very abstract idea of a God, right? If we were all theists, right? If everybody believed in God and they just didn't know much about what his attributes were, or what he does, or what the capabilities are, or whether there's any kind of, moral refereeing going on, or whether he was merely just a form of energy that sort of kicked off the universe, who knows? But if everybody had that kind of inert a sense of God, this would be a pretty happy place, right? So that's an important thing that I think will help bring authenticity and make it authentic when you exhibit that empathy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of religions have a lot more tolerance for those outside of their religion than Christianity does. That's a main sticking point I see, because they believe Jesus says, "I'm the only way," and every other way is just a satanic trap. And so even the most loving, gentle of religions, Buddhism or Shinto, are disregarded as some kind of satanic, deception, which it's hard to assail those beliefs when you've grown up being indoctrinated, with them. But yeah, that's the rub, I think, because as I was reading through your scenarios, and I think some of them are very similar to what I write about in Toxic, as you'll find as you finish. But especially like the one where the guy, he pushes his friend in the mud, or the other guy in the mud or in the pit, and then brings him out, and then that's the salvation story, isn't it? I mean, that's the gospel message, where God damned us so he could save us. and then make us worship him the rest of our lives, all through eternity, because of his greatness. And that's what I point at, the flaws in that thinking, or where Jesus heals the blind guy and he says, well, this guy was created this way so that I could receive glory. I'm like, wait a minute, what kind of horrible psycho parent would blind their children just so they could cure them and then get glory out of it later on? It's just very psychopathic, and so those are the kinds of things that I point at. That's very similar in the idea that trying to help people, what I call metafaith, this concept of being shoved in the water to drown only to be rescued, and to say, oh, thank you, the rescue, and the rescuer never lets you forget the favor that he did. I saved you from drowning, even though I pushed you in. It's that totally resonated with me in that regard.
Yes, that's yeah, the story, the vignette in my book is called "The Hole I Saved You From." Yeah, and I don't know. Well, I know now, but I think I know now, but I didn't understand why that argument wasn't more powerful to Christians. Why it didn't make them stop and scratch their head about the whole basis of the religion. But yeah, I think that so much of the topics about testing Christianity's veracity that go toward philosophy or some of the cosmological argument, analyzing Bible contradictions, they just aren't going to penetrate Christians. That if they were going to work, they would have worked, right? That I'm sure everybody who goes to that area, to those lengths to talk about that kind of stuff, figured that those would be effective responses to Christians, right? But they're not. So that's why I say that there should be more focus on the higher level fundamental questions, and these should be circled. These should be there should be variations at a very high level, because the detailed ones don't make any difference. We already discussed that earlier, that Christians would have no problem thinking that God could get around those problems. Yeah, I mean, higher level issues. There's another individual who making a very strong argument about the immorality of God, for example, to even bring people into existence without giving them an option to opt out, right? He defines morality as any imposition on another being against their will. And so for God to force people into a world that they may not want to be in is intrinsically immoral. And if he truly is, as he and others assert, is omnibenevolent, then just by definition, a better world, a more moral world, would be one in which you had the option to opt out and go to another world, another universe of your
Yeah,
choosing.
not
And
play the game. Right.
you'd still be able to live in this world. And if you
Right.
wanted to experience and be shaped by and mature with the hard lessons that this world offers, you certainly could remain here, but you wouldn't have to. Now, that's a very powerful argument to me. And so arguments like this at the high level seem to be where we ought to corral this discussion more.
I think this is where my experience of being a toxic believer for decades comes into play, and to help you understand the toxic mindset, which is what I do a lot of in toxic, is because I used to be there. I was one of them. I know exactly what they're going to response is going to be. And what you said there, yeah, philosophically it makes certain sense, but you're saying morality in the way that we are limited to as human beings, and you've kind of forgotten the argument as well. God is God. He can do whatever he wants. We're just these lowly pieces of clay that he made us. And the argument will skew towards, but he saved us. He gave us a way out of our horribleness, which again, it's complete rubbish. But that's the fallback, because what you've fortunately not had to endure your whole life growing up in the household that you did was the doctrine, the indoctrination of all these beliefs that I've had to tear down, and write about. So I feel like I'm an insider. Like, I know the stuff inside and out. And that's why I try to write about those things, because I know the toxic mindset. When you were talking, I was like formulating the responses that a toxic Christian would throw at you, and how I know the unassailable belief, because at the high level of things, the ultimate answer is going to be, well, God's God and I'm not. So, and how do you get past that? You know, I mean, and that's why I didn't try to, I didn't try to fight that as much as use it, use it in saying, look, I know what you believe. And that's why I went to say, okay, let's go with your belief. This is the word of God. And I'm not going to do any spinning or tricks or anything. I'm simply going to show you what it says, and let you answer for these things. And that's what the tactic that I took. But so I think they're both very difficult, both challenging. As someone who's rational thinking like you, your philosophical points and your scenarios make sense to me. Like, I get it. I'm right there with you. But when the doctrine that you're fighting against tells you not to trust your rational brain and to simply just trust God, and that God is God and we're not supposed to understand his ways, then that becomes part of the problem.
It certainly does.
Yeah, yes, I know. It's difficult. It's really frustrating.
Yeah, I'm like I said, I'm I don't know if I said I was a nerd, but I am, and so I really enjoy the minute details of the arguments, like that you really break them out. You really expand on these things in your books. I'm really enjoying it, even
Thank you.
on 70 or something pages in. Um, um, so um, I guess maybe what I've come away with from the book is that, there's no slam dunk, right? I didn't throughout, not in whatever thoughts that I have or original ideas that I had, not through the slog of writing a book, and not at this point after the fact uh, have I come up with the way to make a difference that's like a pill, so to speak, right? But I do think that there's a path where people of on either side of it, right? Believers and non-believers can talk, and if there's enough empathy and the arguments are constrained, if that is to say, if people use these kind of vignettes to discuss topics and use some of the techniques that I've given to help keep um, folks from going off into entirely different philosophical tool belts to discuss things, then it helps. That's a big part of what I wanted to put forth, and what I think is helpful is that if even with this simplistic instrument that I've given, which is a picture, right? Or draw a picture, right? There's something kind of uh, low level or maybe silly or something sounding about insisting that people use pictures, but
I
goodness,
liked your pictures. I thought they were helpful, and like Kurt Vonnegut, was a Cat's Cradle. Is that the one where he draws pictures in? I think they're simple. They're great illustrations. That's why we have icons. They're representations of something. So that's how the early people, before they could read, this is how they were taught, with pictures. So it makes perfect sense.
but I use them not to be trite, and I put a lot of effort into avoiding sarcasm and
Hmm.
mockery. The
Yes.
pictures are meant to expand on a strategy I made in the strategy section of the book, where I explained that constraining the discussion is important. Having there be some ground rules to where the conversation can go. I specifically talked about the very easy escape route that probably anybody can do it, but in this discussion, Christians will use the ability to move between the matters of whether the Christianity is true and whether there's a God. It's very easy to answer questions. You kind of did it a couple of minutes ago, I noticed. And it's so easy for them to get out of answering one question by going to the other direction, right? So I think it really helps the discussion, and it's earnest, right? To say to them up front, let's not do that. This is why I will be able to get out of answering your questions, and this is why you'll be able to escape from answering mine. So let's be very careful. Let's use this picture to help constrain it. Let's only talk about it in this context. And I'm not sure if it's going to solve the problem, but I think it'll be helpful.
No, I love the approach. I'm again because you're approaching it with such a gentle hand, whereas mine was a sledgehammer. And it because we were coming from different emotional states. I was writing out of anger and frustration and just feeling ripped off and feeling lied to and just feeling like, my God, 40 years of my life has just been 50 years of my life has just been wasted. you know and all that guilt and all the horrible things that come with Christianity, the feelings of worthlessness and the depression that comes with it, and just the awfulness. Who's going to pay me for that? I want retribution. Um,
Mhm.
and so you're coming from a much healthier place of approaching things with the gentle hand, and mine was anything but, because I was writing a book fueled with rage, but academic rage. I can turn you have a gentle hand where I'm saying, I'm just going to shove it in your face. But um, I did want to ask, through your process, that you've come up with these scenarios, and you were limiting to the discussion to these very specific areas and agreeing on kind of the rules of discussion. Did you find, and talking with anyone who is a believer, have you found that you were able to kind of loosen up any of these knots in the giant ball at all, or make any kind of progress in the fact that they could say, I never really considered that. I have to think more about that. Because in some ways, that's a success, you know?
Yes. So, like I said, I didn't try to, nor did I actually prove out the effectiveness of my arguments to change a mind uh, in total. But yes, they do start to work. I noticed when I would talk about them and ask the same questions over and over. That's another theme I gave, is repeating things in slightly different ways and slightly different formats. That it got them to answer the question differently and in a more expanded way as time went on. I noticed that some of them wanted to would be quicker to want to change the subject when I asked the question the third, the fourth, the fifth time. And I was careful not to badger, right? I'm not just saying, hey, let me ask you this again, right?
Hmm.
It's not like that. You camouflage the next iteration of the very same matter so that they can think about it differently, right? That difference in perspective is, in my opinion, is all important. So yes, Mark, it did start to work. I can't wait to put it into practice more
Hmm.
going forward now that I'm finished with it, because I would like to be able to showcase its effectiveness in a more straightforward way. After all, it is a debate book. I put forth strategies. I tell you that they work. I'd like to have a better track record of being able to show them. But I do have good reason to believe they do.
Yeah, well, that's great. There are only a couple people I've been able to debate my faith with, and one, we were in church together for quite a long time. She's a good friend of mine, and although she's left the church, but she's still struggling with her faith. And she read Toxic, and she has her own takes on these issues. So I know that she's still a believer. She's just disenfranchised with the religious aspect and the church aspect. And the other was a cousin of mine who definitely, we both came into it knowing we weren't going to convince the other. And we loved each other, so it wasn't like we were trying to. It was just a matter of talking through things. That itself, I think, is helpful, and I appreciate the gentle hand with which you approach these things. And that's something that I don't think I'll ever be able to get to, because I'm going to spend the rest of my life processing, religious trauma syndrome. But I'm glad that you found success in this, and that you've been able to kind of walk that walk in a way with approaching things in a philosophical way and a rational way, and that you've kind of came up with these concepts. Did you the Christians that you interviewed, were they aware that you were writing a book about this, correct? Or what was the context in which that you interviewed them?
Yes,
Unless
they
you asked it.
were.
Yeah.
Yes, they were aware. I made it very clear. I asked them to acknowledge the disclaimer that I wanted to be able to use this in the discussion of and promotion of the book. I mean, that was
Okay.
made very, very clear to all of them. But the context of it was research for the book, right? I want to talk with you about the topics I've written and find out what you think. Do they work? Am I saying things that make sense to you?
Okay.
Right. I wanted to find out if I was just my thoughts were a bunch of recycled arguments that they had never thought of, or maybe that were just as offensive as anything else they've heard. Right. I didn't know, and you don't know those things until you sit down and talk to 5 or 10 people and see what
Sure.
happens. Right.
Right. Exactly.
So, and let's see, just to expand on it more, I do have, I've videotaped all the, I didn't tape it, but there's videos of all of them, but I haven't put them on my website yet, and I need to do that. So that's going to happen. And it's interesting. I'll take excerpts, just only because of the time elements that they remain interesting. But a lot of them have moved between faiths, right, or between denominations. A lot of them have had struggles with either how their faith helps them with some mental struggles that they're having, or having crises in their faith at times, and then moving to other denominations. I found it was just fascinating. But as I said in the book, the things that were common to them were striking to me, and it's that consistency, right? There's this. We talked earlier, you and I did, about this refusal, right? And I this is a theme in the first part of my book. I'm stating Christians have a implicit subconscious refusal to, in this one domain, to consider things out that the Christianity, the Bible, Jesus aren't true. And I talk specifically about how it's there's a very odd border around this area. They can be very friendly and open to hearing you, right? It's not like they're not hearing what you're saying. It's not like they're saying, why don't you skip to a subject that we can actually talk about? That's not how the Christians I talked to reacted. It had all the trappings of a normal, rational conversation that you figured would culminate in somebody going, that's a good question. Maybe I should explore that more. But it didn't come to that. And in my conclusion, it's somehow those thoughts that you're putting out there, those ideas, they don't quite, they're not allowed to intermingle with the part of the belief forming mind where revision to ideas happens, right, at its core, right? I don't presume to be a neuroscientist and tell you what exactly is happening, or a psychologist, but I'm telling you that the Christians I spoke to listened. They were very much trying to have a good, earnest conversation with me, and the ideas just penetrate. It did not penetrate. They bounce off. They the faith test, as I put it, just is not allowed to occur. So you have to be aware of this very kind of unusual cordoning off of consideration about facts in this one domain, right?
Right,
I hope it's very clear
right,
in what I'm saying now and in my book, that I don't believe, Christians are, you can generalize them as not bright, or they're not, that they don't know how to think straight, and you can see that in other aspects of their life. No, it's a very specific domain with a very specific phenomenon that's going on, which is absolutely fascinating.
right. Because in other aspects of their lives, they could, like most people can use rational thinking. If they're a Christian Scientist or a doctor, they believe in science. It's not like they're rejecting all those things and they're flat earthers and those kinds of things. We're not saying that at all. But no, I agree. There's an unassailable part of faith. It's like people will do anything for their convictions except challenge them or question them. And I think that's because it's troubling to do so, because especially the longer you've held the belief, if you're taught this, it becomes so fundamentally earth-shattering and shattering. You don't know what the existential reality of anything is. Your metaphysics are completely blown out of the water. Mine were. I felt like the cosmic rug had been pulled up and I'm just standing in space, like hovering, like there's no ground underneath me anymore. Everything that I thought was true was gone. And I'm like, what do I have to believe in anymore? Faith. And I realized, oh, it's me. I can believe in myself. But it is a horrible thing to feel that reality fracturing. And so I think the psyche protects against that. It is more easy to swallow the pill that Christianity presents you than to accept the shattering fact of the reality behind the religion. And I think that's more troubling, because then what are you left to believe in? You know, I think that's what you.
What you're talking about is the shortcoming that I have, the biggest shortcoming I think that I have when I'm trying to write a book on this subject. And that is, I can't imagine that, or I can try to imagine it, but I
Mhm.
really can't get inside and understand just how powerful it is. And even if I could, it doesn't make a difference, because if there's indoctrination going on, right? Indoctrination is effective, whether we're talking about religion or in some other area.
Political, political the same way, right? As we see in our nation, we're just being torn this way because everyone is taking a side. It can be only one or the other. I'm like, no, it can't be. We've got a whole spectrum of beliefs. So don't fall into this lie. No, indoctrination is dangerous no matter where it comes from.
I should also say that this is probably a good time to mention that I've sort of changed how I'm approaching this whole matter, right? To me, the obvious way to uh, the reason you'd write a book like this is to convince people to stop being Christian. Hey, wake up, listen, these ideas don't make sense. This is what you should believe, right? So I was kind of proselytizing from my own agnostic way of thinking, right? A vacuum of a God idea, so to speak. But now I'm mellowing out more. Now I want to kind of explore more about good ways to have very fruitful, honest discussions between believers and non-believers. I want to find out. I want to get more into the loosening of those knots. Um, I want people to be able to have more civil discussions. I want people to be able to trust one another more when they're having discussions. To I don't want to be a part of anything that adds the coarseness to this discussion. There's no point in that to me, and there's a point not to do that. I think that's very important. So that's kind of where I'm going now with it.
That's good, because we are demonizing one another mercilessly. politically and every other thing. I think social media has made us monsters out of a lot of us. A lot of brave keyboard warriors out there. You say something you don't like, and they'll eviscerate you. And to be able to disagree on things and still be civil to one another, and like I still have friends and family who are believers, and I love them. It just they know that I'm not a believer, and they struggle with that. But at the end of the day, I hope it doesn't change their love for me, and the friends I have who are believers, I'm not going to ridicule them. I want them to see my position. All I want is for understanding. I guess that's all I'm looking for. Just know why I don't believe anymore. That's all. I'm not trying to change their mind at all or make them stop believing like you, but having a civil discussion about beliefs and non-beliefs would be wonderful. And if we could come to that place in this country, because that would be really healing, because man, we tear each other apart. We are quickly dividing into two camps, and we got to find a way to stop this. It's just awful what's happening.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, that's the noble goal that I have interest and maybe a little bit of influence on at this point. So, yeah.
That would be wonderful. Oh, um, tell me a little bit about the pseudonym you're going by, Pastor Lucky. How did this persona come into being?
Um, well, I don't come at this with an interesting background, or a lot of agnostics and atheists I've noticed come from kind of where a story that's not too different from yours, where they've been indoctrinated. It's been a very intense style of Christianity, and now they're here to tell the tale from the other stand and how bad it was. And so I wanted to have, I thought in lieu of that, why don't I have something interesting as the kind of author that people look to, since I'm a little more boring than that. So there's a story. One of the vignettes in the book is called Pastor Lucky's Magic Cure-All, and it's basically about a snake oil salesman pitching some elixir to somebody who has cancer, right? And the brother of this person goes and looks and finds a traveling carnival and realizes it's nothing more than a snake oil scenario, and just sees what the nature of that story is. And it's really somebody who's charismatic, who can play games with themselves and with others, convinces themselves and others that they can do something that other people can't, and those other people get convinced, and they go evangelizing these ideas and spreading the word and testifying to its powers. And all of a sudden you've got this legend that forms around one of these things, and the facts just sort of go out the window because it just kind of works, and you just don't get it until you get it, kind of thing. And I hope it's clear at this point just how much this aligns with the Jesus as God story. So to answer
Right,
your
the
question,
Gospels, right? Because Christians don't ask the question, who was there in the desert with Jesus to record what happened? You know, right? They
yeah,
they and they don't know, like, hey, this book was written 50 years after his death. They don't understand the historical context of the huge messianic push for a Messiah that was going on around the time Jesus was supposedly around and before that, and the influence of Zoroastrianism, and they don't get that, you know.
that's right. That's right. And that's probably an even better point than I was making, but it was just
No,
that
no,
that's
I was
where
just
the synonym.
piggybacking on yours. Sorry, but right, I agree. When I read that, I'm like, oh yeah, I saw it. It's like watching The Life of Brian, Monty Python. It's like it's so close. It's probably very close to that. Blessed are the cheesemakers. What it was probably when, and I remember being so feeling it was such a blasphemous movie back when I first saw it, because I was a Christian at the time, and I'm like, oh, I don't, man, their guys are going to hell, And now when I watch it, I'm like, oh God, this is probably really closer to the truth than not, this. because it's a game of phone. It's the phone game, like I slice my paper cut on my finger and I call my mom, and then 15 relatives later I get a call, oh Mark, I heard you sawed your hand off. Oh my God, are you okay? The story just grows, and I'm like, imagine a 50-year phone game. That's what the gospels are, you know so much so that by the second century, forget the guy's name, I mentioned him in Toxic, where he had to say, explain it all. Like, oh, God must have given them perfect memory, divine memory. That's it. It explains it. And then ever since then, for 1900 years, that's been the story. It just accepted it. Some guy said, yeah, perfect memory. Okay. And everyone else just like swallows it, you know, without even thinking.
Yeah, and depending on what their kind of their how passionate they are about it, right? It's either a matter of them just not knowing about it, not really wanting to think it bears exploring, or it's one of these matters where if God wanted to, he could just make it all work, right? Through all the mistakes, through all the craziness that went along the way, the net result is what he intended, right? He knew
Right.
all these.
Exactly. Through all things, God works, right? All things work toward the glory of God, right? Yeah.
So yeah, I've abandoned those kind of arguments. These are the kinds of things I'm talking about. When you start talking about what's rational, it it just doesn't track with them. You're never going to get
Yeah.
anywhere.
I know it's insanely frustrating. I'm not sure if I included this passage. I very well could have. Where to me it feels like I'm in Dante's hell. I'm pushing up that boulder, and I know it's gonna crush me. I know it's gonna roll back on me, but I am compelled to push that damn rock up the hill. Because I have to. I am screaming at the top of my lungs. I'm holding up the book, or it's like Soylent Green, it's made of people, or I'm holding up the cookbook to serve man. It's a cookbook. It's a cookbook, and everyone else is like, what? I'm not hearing it. That's kind of the hell I'm living in. Right? So it's just like, it's become a Kafka-esque nightmare. You know what I mean? I have to do it though. I can't not. If that makes any sense. Yeah.
Yes.
I never
It,
felt this much fervor and passion to preach the gospel, probably because at an early age, I knew the cognitive dissonance. By the age 10, it was like already like tearing me apart, and there was something just intrinsically wrong with the story. But this, I'm 100% convinced of. I'm completely happy to share and proselytize, Yeah.
there was I think it's the last uh, scene in the book, a vignette where I talk about, where I help the reader imagine a scenario where Bible scholars stumble upon, the first copy of the Bible, right? And there are two pages that they just now discover are stuck together, right? And so there's going to be some new information, and they're just about to read it, right? The world, all the Christians are going to get to hear something from the Bible that they've never heard before. And so, but you have to think about what that means, right? What if it doesn't comport with what you already love and know about the Bible, right? What if it's something objectionable? And it was really interesting. I've got video of that. I'll show it, to sort of watch the Christians I spoke with process that. It did not immediately cause doubt or start making them wonder, but it you could tell the wheels were spinning, and um, um, some of these contradictions nested in contradictions start to reveal themselves when you start thinking about it like that. So yeah,
Hmm.
some scenes are helpful.
Yeah, I look at the last verse of the book of Gospel of John, where it said, basically says, Jesus did so many things that all the books in the world couldn't contain them. And I tried to talk with my cousin, one of my cousins, about that because he's a toxic believer. And I said, hey, you've only got four gospels. Let's just pretend this, I know it's hyperbole. All the books in the world couldn't contain them. I said, let's just pretend that there are, say, 1,000 more gospels. Okay. Not a billion. Let's just go 1,000, a number we could count to easily. I go, well, doesn't that amaze you? The fact that you have four out of 1,000, doesn't that let you know that maybe you don't have the whole story? And he's like, no, I know enough. I I know enough. That's all I need to know. Like, well, can't argue with that. I mean, someone who's so willingly sticking his head up his own ass and like willingly ignorant, and just like, nope, I refused to let anything come in to shatter what I've already accepted to be as true. That to me is every bit as damning as the people who don't believe the election was real, or who believe that Oswald acted alone, or any of those things. It's just like you will refuse to acknowledge what evidence and truth about this, and because yeah, yeah, and so I was that's why I was really happy with your book in that regard. Like, I want to know, and people have studied this too. Like, there is something unassailable to faith that since if your approach brings about some of the loose thing of that. I'm not going to say the conversion or deconversion, any loose thing, and providing some kind of conversation would be helpful, I think, in the larger
And
scheme of things.
to your point, what about the passages that provide evidence, like self-evidence, like Romans 9:15, right? Talking about how God really has kind of made his decisions about who he's going to pardon, who he's going to have mercy on.
Right. The predestination, which was a whole sect of Christianity, though, with the people who believed, it's all preordained, and all you can do is hope that you're in that very limited number. The rest of you are just screwed.
Right, but it's still there. It's a
Yeah,
very important,
yeah. Was it the
it's a
Calvinists, I
very
think? Yeah,
remarkable thing to be in the Bible, and it still gets used, and people don't understand what exactly that means, and how the extent to which that contradicts just completely with the notion of real love. That
right,
you cannot have both.
right. I mean, and with the fact that we look at when Paul was telling people to not marry and things like that in the first century, it's because he was thinking Jesus was coming back like next week. Like, look, guys, there's no time for this shit. Jesus is coming back in 5 days. You got to get your stuff together, man. And that's the thing. It's like, what's it been, about 1900 years, um, and they don't quite grasp the reality is that he was writing these books, his letters, to certain audiences, not to anyone who spoke English, because there was no one speaking around English at the time, and all the books of the Bible were not written for them, and they were not it's a patchwork. It's not a seamless garment. It's a patchwork of contradiction, different audiences, different methods, and to shove an interpretation upon the text that fits an ideology is what's been done since the very beginning, since the books that were chosen for the Bible. That's how they were chosen. We don't like the politics of this book, so we're not going to include it. That was how arbitrarily some of these books were dismissed. Well, this guy says something that we don't agree with, so it can't be, because we know better. So there's this human arrogance and conceit that comes into how the book was, all the 66 books were put together, or more if you're have a Catholic Bible. Um, there's just so much Bible history that Christians are unaware of, but I don't even know if that would make a difference. But I honestly, at this point, I have no idea what's going to make a difference.
It wouldn't make a difference, I would assert.
Yeah,
Which is why I didn't decided not to go down the rabbit hole with it in my
yeah,
book. I want to keep it at the high level. If we can't get past the questions that I'm asking, there's no reason to go any deeper.
right. You're looking at things at like intro to philosophy, intro to ethics, 101, kind of looking at and extrapolating from a scenario, some kind of moral truth or reality, and then applying it in a religious sense or to the believer. And applying is something innate that's being taught to believers. Here's a story about Daniel in the lion's den, and now you apply it to your life and say, when you are in a lion's den, metaphysically, God will save you. That's not true at all, but that's the thinking. So that could be you're in. The fact that they're used to applying this abstract concepts into their daily lives, thinking that God will do this for them, that might be the avenue that you get in with okay, since you are good at applying things, here's a moral absolute. How do we inject that in? It's almost like you're like an inoculation in a way.
That's what I was hoping to be. But I will say this though, Mark, you're right. You're 100% right. The book is at a philosophy 101 level, but I don't mean to imply that that the deeper levels of discussion and consideration and analysis about philosophy are not important to have. I just don't think Christianity ever earned its place at the table to be part of that discussion. Those are not good, well-grounded tenets of philosophy, if you ask me. So I think it's very important. I reached out to philosophers, anthropologists, psychologists in the writing of this book. I asked for feedback. I wanted substantive feedback. I got it. So I care a great deal about that. But I just want to make it very clear that even though my book is high level, it's supposed to be something that anybody can understand. You don't need to have specialized knowledge to be to understand and be swayed by the arguments one way or the other in my book. That doesn't mean that I think the nuances of what people are studying, even Bible historians and scholars, isn't important.
Mhm.
It certainly is. Christianity just doesn't rise to that level.
Right. We can't get to those more nuanced arguments if the big ones won't allow those thoughts to come through, right? The shield
Exactly.
is still up. Right. No, exactly. And I think that's because of my being on the inside. That's why I chose the inside route, because I'm thinking I need to disrupt this from within, as Shakespeare writes, to be have the Christians hoisted with their own petards. I'll dig under their minds. Um, and that's the hope. And by you know here, this is I'm not making this stuff up. This is in your Bible. Yeah, God says it's great to smash babies against rocks. Okay, God is thinking, here's the best way to populate the earth: incest. Okay, uh, Adam and Eve had 3 sons. Let that sink in. Okay, so where did everyone else come from? You know, um, and just start thinking about that. Here's the most supreme deity being in the universe, and the best he could come up with was incest. You know, and then the toxic doctrine that comes from that, where they try to rationalize the behavior. It's because the gene pool wasn't corrupted yet, and all these horrible things that they will use, as I write about in the chapter on incest. So I get it. It's like there is such a force against it can't, anything that fights against the reality that has been constructed for them automatically gets dismissed, because it's just it completely it's unassailable in the fact that they refuse to let anything challenge it. It's like they look the wrong way. Nope, I can't see it. They show them a mirror. Nope, there's no face in that mirror. I'm not going to look at that. It doesn't. That's not me. It is staggering, the kind of mental gymnastics that it's required to kind of make any headway, let alone substantial headway. So
Yeah,
I
and I'm
I
learning so much from your book, Mark. Like I'm like it's right
oh,
here. I'm
thank
reading
you.
it. I love it. So to your point about, I think you're making a stronger point about maybe somebody with a more fundamentalist view just now, and I totally agree. Um, but I say, even if you give them the benefit of the doubt, even if we're talking about the essence of Christians, as I call them, those that maybe don't really care about some of the Bible minutia, who see it more in a poetic or uh, um, metaphorical light, right? They see allegory as opposed to kind of an
It's
historical account.
inspired. It's still God inspired, right? That,
Right.
yeah.
Even if you're talking about the philosophy of Christianity from their kind of more reasonable standpoint, I still think that that when you explore the morals, right, the net result of the philosophy of Christianity, right, it's such a mishmash of um, things that are commonsensical and things that are quite offensive. And I just don't think that it's a good enough candidate to be taken seriously in philosophical conversations. It just hasn't earned it. I'm not saying that it's wrong. I'm just saying, and that it's been proven wrong. I'm saying if a criticism of my book is that, hey, you've written this at too high a level, you need to at least have a master's degree in philosophy before you start opining about this. I would wholeheartedly disagree. You don't have to. If you want to criticize my assertions about other gods being present, or whether we have good evidence for a, a theistic body in this universe, then that's a valid criticism. But you don't have to have good education to be able to point out some of the obvious shortcomings of Christianity.
Right. Yeah. And by high level, I want to carefully make sure that people not take that as high-minded or high level, and that you need the superior academic ability to analyze or background. Like you said, you don't need a PhD, but you're looking at things at the macro, not the micro.
Right.
And you are taking things at a very kind of basic, I won't say superficial, basic entry level. Like, well, let's just look at questions of belief and morality and conviction, those kinds of basic concepts, and try to come to some understanding there. So your book is really about approaching and trying to come with an understanding both sides, and allowing people to at least mull over the considerations of an act, whether it is moral or good, in the broadest sense possible, and then the hope of applying it to their belief. Like, their God does this, so if it's not moral here, why is it moral over here? That's how I read your book.
That's right. There's a lot of street epistemology in the book, and yeah, that's right. I mean, let's test whether the way you're forming your beliefs kind of makes sense. Let's see if we can come to
Hmm.
agreement about that at least. And you're right, Mark. Um, I won't refute your use of the word basic to describe the level that some of my arguments are at, but it's like it goes back to that scene I gave you about the car that was smashed along the side of the road. It, it it's supposed to be basic at
Hmm.
that level. When somebody else walks up there and claims that that car was not smashed, but imploded on itself, you don't get more complicated. You don't get more lower level. You don't explore the granularities. There's a basic, if that's the word we're going to use, there's a fundamental level that we need to be at to discuss whether that makes sense and explore going beyond.
It's a first step,
Right.
perhaps. It is like what Plato would, or Socrates would make an argument. You have to start with a basis of where everyone can agree on something. Can we find what it is that we all agree on? Like in the nature with the car, like it we can rationalize things in our brain, a series of events, and most rational people would take that. The guardrail and the car is dented, it's right next to one another. We see the same color of the paint that's on the car and the guardrail. We see a skid mark perhaps on the road. We can use, was it, was it deductive or inductive? Deductive reasoning to put the chain of events together. That's how police procedurals are done. We find evidence and we make a picture based on what the evidence tells us. We point to a hypothesis, and that's exactly what your approach is, in a gentle way, by looking at these things in the first steps in the simplest of terms. But simple is not bad. It's just like, we need to start somewhere, and let's try to start with an understanding here before we can move on to anything else.
Right. That's right. That's what I'm saying. That Christianity certainly has fundamentals on which it's built on and built around. They're not good fundamentals. So I'm hoping to point that out. So fundamental is probably an even more apt term for it. Yeah.
No, I agree. I agree. Now, how long did it take you to write the ME playbook?
I think the whole process was about a year from the time I started writing down these kind of independent ideas to the time when I closed it out and published it. Yeah, the writing took it was a slog. It was hard for me to get through, to have it have it be cohesive to me, to make the cases I want to make, to be well organized, to break out the dimensions of the arguments that I was making, and have it not be repetitive, and have it be interesting to the reader. And I also wanted something that was novel too. I didn't just want to write another book that made my case like everybody else's. So that's why I wanted to make sure that when somebody read it, whether they're a academician and writer like you, or whether they're just somebody on YouTube, it seems like I'm getting the good praise that the book garners is kind of similar. It's like, hey, it's an easy read. I get it. You make your points, and there's something that the reader can get. That's what I wanted out of it, right?
That's the technical writer in you coming out, right?
So
You're plain language. I mean, that's why I love technical writing, plain language. I'm a plain language advocate, which flies in the face of academia. But keep it simple, stupid, or keep it short and sweet. I'm an advocate of that, so I get it. You're chunking information in bite-sized pieces. You're making it accessible for anyone who wants to read it and attempt to apply it. And you're not shoving it down their throats. It's a very easy to understand read, which is the first basis of understanding it all. Is to people have to know what you're talking about, and to try to make it communicated as simply as possible.
I think I'll say something since about from the writer's standpoint, and for some of your readers in your audience who are also writers, right? I don't pretend to have any wisdom or special knowledge about how to write a book well or anything. I'm just going to give you the benefit of my experience of having done it, right? Because I tried a couple of times to write a book beforehand, and it didn't take, right? I didn't get there. It was failed in the sense that I never finished it, but I didn't fail in this sense because the book was finished. It's written. It's a real book. It's published. But so when you set out to do that, if you're concerned, and you should be, that you could fail if you don't plan it out right, or if you don't know the points at which you're going to get stuck, try to have a plan that you can definitely abide by. Try to make some goals that are reachable. Now, I'm not saying don't shoot high, okay? But I am saying see the path all the way through. This is hard sometimes for writers, even especially fiction writers, right? Who don't necessarily see the entire culmination of the end of the story, right? Sometimes there can be a justification not to know that until you move through that. I think that's a mistake.
Yeah, the pantsers do that a lot. There's a term, pantsers. They write by the seat of the pants. They have an idea for a story. They might have a sentence or two for an idea for a chapter, but they just make it up as they go. And for someone who's an academic like me who plots, I'm a plotter. I've got a 26-page outline for my current book, color coded. That trying to pants it would drive me crazy as a writer. But for them, trying to plot it out would, so we're all creatively different. But I get what you're saying. I think it is important, no matter what, to have that goal or plan, especially when you're writing a book the way what you're doing, is because you know what it is that you're trying to communicate, and you have to have that end result in mind as you go. You can't just it doesn't book like this, like yours, doesn't happen by mistake.
Yeah, and you're right. I know you're experienced in this, so I'll take your lead on that. That there are people come at it from different standpoints, right? Different skill sets, right? Some people are pantsers. That's what they bring to the process, and I mean, go for it, right? That certainly can work, right? Sometimes people get
For fiction, certainly, right.
Some people get lucky with that approach. It does work, with just being fortunate for how it comes out. And sometimes just writing a different book over and over and over again will eventually get you where you want to be. I know that there's more than one way to do it, but I'm telling you that I narrowly avoided failing to complete this endeavor because my plan was not all that good. It turned out to be just good enough, and I got it done in a reasonable period of time. It didn't sit on a shelf and finally get done in 15 years. I would have considered that a failure, right? To me, that would have been. That's not, I needed to get something out now. So if you're like me and you have a book and you want to get it done, I'm not saying to have the end written necessarily completely, but you should have a very sort of comfortable path, even if it's going to take you a long time and a lot of energy, and you're going to have to spend a lot more time on it. You really need to be able to see through to the end of the tunnel, and then you'll get it done, right? And hey, maybe it won't be the book that you wanted, but you can build on that, right? The next book you do, you can have your own approach, which is more based on your own style. But if you're writing your first book, or you're changing genres and you want to make sure you get something done, don't make it more grueling than you need to. That's my advice.
There's always the process, like writing the draft is always hard, because you have an idea, but it's still, you don't know from one sentence to the next whether it's good or not, and that's why what I hated to do when I was in college was revise. I thought, okay, I've got my draft done, I wrote my draft, it's done. Like, no, that's a hard part, certainly, but revision is every bit as difficult. And so you just learn by doing. As I teach my students, you just get to the point where you can write a better rough draft, but revision is still key. But you still have to have that in mind, that goal, and I agree with you. Sometimes writing is a slog. My last book felt that way. I wanted to write it in a month, and it's a pulp, so it was easy to do that. But I only had like one good day of writing where I felt, one or two out of the 30 or 28 or so, that I felt like I'm doing good work today. The rest I felt nothing, and it felt like, oh, this is just grueling. Like, you know, and I think with a lot of writers, they'll hit a wall like 3/4 of the way through, where, like, at least I do, like by the time I hit 3/4 of the way through, I'm done with the book. Like, I want to just finish this thing because I've rehearsed the end so many times in my head. I know what's going to happen. I just have to force my fingers to do the work, to type the words. So I'm not sure if that was something that you felt as you went through this book, or you had different emotional response to it. Because, like, when you finish it, there's a great sense of relief in a way, and that you can release it into the world. But you have to go through, it's like it's an emotional state of trial, before you get to that point.
You do. And yes, I did, Mark. I had trouble having a refined iterative process. That was hard. And I think that's, maybe you said it better than I was attempting to say it. And that is, have a real good sense of process. You have a story in mind, right? You have a thesis you're going to break out and defend, whether it's fiction or nonfiction or what have you. But and you're passionate about it, and that is what you want to make sure. That's what you are really trying to safeguard doesn't get lost in the process. And I get that, but you're going to find, in my humble opinion, that the process is very important in how you get there, right? Otherwise, you may not complete it. Your drafts may go off in a direction that you don't want. You may not have been anticipating what it takes to refine it to your level. So get good at the process. I say it doesn't rob you of whatever magic fairy dust, or whatever word you want to use, that you're bringing to the story. It won't go away. It's already formed. It's already on paper. Got it on your one pager. It's not going anywhere. You have nothing to lose by coming at this like in the way that a foreman or a supervisor does to a construction site, and saying, okay, things need to get done. Things need to be built, right? I don't think you have anything to lose.
No, I agree. Sometimes you get in the way of your own self when writing. You just, like, you stand in the way of your success, or just getting it done. But I completely understand that. And that's the one thing I love about the show. And I know we've been here for about an hour and a half, so I want to wrap things up and not keep you for the rest of your day. But that's the one thing I've loved about this show so much is that interviewing and talking with a lot of writers who are so very different. We all kind of go through this different process. We start with an idea and we end up with a book, but how we get there, it's so unique and different for every writer. And that's what I really love about doing this show, and like for meeting people like you, and connecting in a way of our views of spirituality that's even from different points. That's great. But just to hear and talk about the creative process, that's still fascinating to me, because there are times like I just don't want to write. And I admire people who have that gumption to write every day, and it's like, bravo. I don't. I got to force myself sometimes to write. And if I'm not feeling like it, it's okay. But just that you've written something, and that you agree, you got to get it done. I will take that also as like, yeah, I got to get back on my own horse and start writing again.
Neat. Well, yeah, you're right that it's neat how there are so many different ways that this can be done, and it's still all culminate in the same basic, a tone. It's a book at the end,
Hmm.
right? It's a story. It's really cool how there can be so many different approaches to it, and I really appreciate that you took time today and showed some interest in me and the book that I've written, and I hope I offered you something of value to your viewers and so forth.
Oh, I'm sure you did, and certainly to me. And I've thoroughly enjoyed this our talk, and I really appreciate you taking the time to meet with me as well. And the last thing I want to ask you, and for all of our viewers, where can we find your books or your
Sure,
book? Yeah.
yeah, it's on Amazon. And the name of the book is Enemy Playbook, 2 words. So you can go right to Amazon and buy it. But I direct most people to the website, Pastor Lucky. It's Pastor, all one word, pastorlucky.com. And there's a button or two on the main page, which takes you to that, to the page on Amazon to buy it.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thanks again. I'm going to do my outro. We're going to get out of here. But thank you again for your time today, Eric. This has been very enlightening, and I'm glad we got a chance to talk about it, because I really liked your book, and that it was such a different approach to things. And I'm glad that we were able to talk about it, because I had a lot of questions like your approach, and now I understand it very thoroughly. And like, okay, it makes so much sense now, because it is a very vastly different approach than how I approach it. So, and now I know why it is so, and that's wonderful. So. You've been watching and listening to Between the Lines. You can find us at unsaneradio.com, listen to full episodes, or download to your device. You can watch us on our YouTube page, Between the Lines Podcast. If you're watching, that's probably where you're at. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. And you can also find us on the Otel Talk channel on Roku. If you know someone who'd like our show, tell them about us. And if you're a writer who'd like to join me for a chat, email me at betweenthelines54@yahoo.com, betweenthelines54@yahoo.com. And Eric, here's my cheesy outro. See you next time. Between the Lines.